Weber is an assistant professor of science, technology, and culture at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. He has a special research interest in the history of science and empire in Southeast Asia. This includes research into how computational technologies can be used to contextualize and provide access to digitalized scientific archives and collections in the field of colonial natural history. And we look forward to hearing more about this project. Our second speaker is Manikarnika Dutta, who has recently completed her Wellcome Trust funded the field project at the Oxford Centre for History of Science, Medicine and Technology. Her research examined the health and sanitary regulation of European seamen in colonial Indian port cities, integrating the history of health, imperial governance, and maritime exchange in British Empire. Our third speaker is Namrata R is an assistant professor in history and at S.N.D.T College of Arts and S.C.B College of Commerce and Science for Women in Mumbai. She is currently working on a monograph on post-independent India smallpox eradication program, which is a projected outcome of her Commonwealth Rutherford Fellowship 2018-2020 at the University of York. And our last speaker is Ugurgul Tunc, who is a PhD candidate at Koç University in Istanbul. Her research interests include the history and architecture of healthcare spaces and curatorial studies. She is the resident curator of the Smithsonian Institute's Outbreak exhibit in Turkey and a contributor to the history section of the Infectious Disease and Clinical Microbiology journal. She is also the PI of the project Birth as a Sensory Experience, Medicine and Tradition in Turkey. And I apologize if I pronounce everything like wrongly. So to start, I want all the speakers to talk maybe for 5-10 minutes, reflecting on the guiding question of the seminar series, which is where are the archives of global history? We started the seminar series with this question. And I want you to to talk about your project considering this question, also commenting about your own research experience, archival practices before the pandemic, how the pandemic has affected your research or how it has made you to think differently about archival practices of global history in relation to science, technology, and census. And with that, if we can start alphabetically, that would be great with Andrews. Thank you. And also, I have to thank you again for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for this very nice introduction. What I will do, I will simply share my screen for a couple of seconds. So thanks also a lot for the invitation to the seminar. And I just want to say something about indeed where are the archives of global history for my own research, and also how the pandemic indeed has somehow changed it or has changed my thinking about that. So the answer to the first question is indeed, I think they're in natural history museums. So these collections of plants and animals and rocks and other naturalia from all over the world that are stored in Europe, but also in the US. And many of these objects have a colonial past, or large parts of these collections have a colonial past. So basically, I look at these objects and plants, animals, and I just give you a kind of visual insight how this world looks like and how these spaces look like. So I look at these objects and I try to link them to other archival material, which is also often stored and often neglected at natural history museums. Because with these specimens that have been transferred over the last 300-400 years from often colonial areas to Europe, to the West, so a lot of additional material came with that. And so that's actually my source for writing a kind of connectivist global history, in the sense that I study objects to understand how our perception of nature and how the history of how natural history is made through interactions of communities, but also specimens across time and also across space. And perhaps one additional slide for now, and then move on. And here is, you see a bit kind of what you encounter in natural history museums, is that you have often these field notes, these field diaries, you have the specimens and also the drawings and the publications. But very often they're disconnected. So you need older biologists that help you to go through these archives and also to bring the material together. And very concretely over the last year, I've been working on, I think it's the biggest archive of flora and fauna of Southeast Asia of the early 19th century, which is stored in the Netherlands at the Natural History Museum. And we were developing kind of tools and also computational methods to study that material, to enrich the material, and also to link the material. And I will say later about that in a second. But about the pandemic, I think often such collections are framed as biodiversity heritage, as purely scientific collections. But I think we have to be very careful with that, because these collections are a carrier of complex cultural or colonial histories. And the challenge indeed, and that I realized that in the pandemic, that when building digital infrastructures to make such collection accessible, you need this kind of cultural component, and often colonial component, to enshrine or to add that to these big infrastructures that are currently developed. That's, I think, really a kind of major challenge. And sometimes I'm at a table with natural scientists looking at such collections, and they say to me, okay, well, what metadata fields should we add to make it also accessible for cultural historians? Or but that's the kind of discussion we sometimes. Yeah, and we as humanities researchers we used to work on very specific projects and kind of small case studies. It's quite a challenge to converse or to communicate with these conglomerates of hundreds of researchers that enrich and work and digitize and tech and work with such big collections. So making these digital surrogates and these digital infrastructures, it's really important that you have this kind of cultural historical expertise, this kind of long-term view that remains involved. That's it for now.
Thank you. And for me, it was my first time seeing something like this kind of material. So I will have some questions, but at the end, we'll ask. It's very interesting. If Mani, is it Mani? Do you want to go next, or Namrata? Do you want? Who wants? We are going alphabetically, so if you want to go.
Hi,
Yeah.
Sarah. Can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. I think that there
No,
was a bit
okay.
problems with the internet. Yeah. So thank you for inviting me, Sarah. And I think it's a very important questions that you've raised, and the seminar hopefully would help us to kind of answer certain issues and provide answers to certain important issues. Now, my PhD project that I kind of completed now, almost I submitted a couple of years back. I worked on the health of the European sailors in Indian port cities. So, and before I go on to say what my research was about, so I would just share a small experience of mine, and that is to do with the archive. So primarily in my first year, I started my project. I sought to kind of work on 3 cities. One was Calcutta, one was Bombay, and the other is Madras. Now, it was due to the fact that, I wasn't able to I had certain problems in working with it at the Chennai archives, which is in Tamil Nadu, like the state archives. It was due to that reason that I kind of just dropped dropped the Madras portion. I just kind of, I decided that I'll just stick to Calcutta and Bombay. And also, one thing again I would like to mention is that to do with the resources, as far as that was concerned. So when I first, so after completing my master's, I think I finished my master's, and then within a couple of days, I was on with my PhD. Now, I was like, as you just mentioned while introducing me, so I worked on the like naval health or maritime health. So there is, I had this kind of idea that perhaps because there has been so much of work on the health of the army when it comes to the Indian Army, I presume that there would be some amount of proper sources when it comes to the health of the seamen or the sailors. But unfortunately, that was not the case. So, and so I started working at the British Library. I was there at the National Archives, like both in London, and I was working at the, at other libraries in London and in Oxford. But somehow, and the period I was looking initially was from 1860 to 1900. Then at the National Archives, someone told me that, the boxes that you're trying to kind of look at, perhaps they kind of either got lost or they actually got, they are lost. I think they've got burned down. And then I realized that a historian actually mentioned in his preface that he kind of had similar experiences. So in that way, like the first year, I started reading secondary sources, and then came I came to India for my field work. So I began with Chennai, where the experience was not good at all. Rather, it was very horrific for me. I used to wait for, for the archivist and to the people who are working there to kind of give me the documents. I had to wait for a very long time, but unfortunately I didn't get them. And then my next, after a month being in Chennai, I went to Mumbai. And in Mumbai, the Maharashtra State Archive was very, very helpful indeed. And there I got quite a considerable amount of material. And then I came to Calcutta and I went to Delhi, which is the National Archives of India. Now, and then when I came back to UK, I realized that, because that if the kind of material that I've got for my research, if I kind of stick to them, it would be somewhere, like echoing the works of other historians, or I would not be able to come up with something very novel, and which I didn't want to. So, like, as first year PhD students, we kind of get into the chapterizations. So what happened was, almost towards the second year of my PhD research, I realized that I need to kind of reframe my entire PhD project and my PhD proposal. So I decided that rather than sticking from 1860 to 1900 and kind of covering two major epidemics, which I first sorted to, one was cholera and the other was plague, I might just kind of I might just end with cholera, and rather I could just begin with the end of the 18th century. So I worked primarily from 1800 to 1900. Now, another reason for telling me all this is that, during COVID, like the challenges that we are facing at this point, we're unable to travel to the archive because of the, because of these international travel restrictions and so on and so forth. Now, but during my PhD also, I kind of faced quite a significant amount of challenges when it came to the sources. Why? Because I couldn't kind of come up with, with a large amount, like with a significant amount of source material when it came to the government records, on basis of which I could start writing and phrasing and start kind of writing out my project. So I kind of started looking for alternative sources. It's not that, these kind of alternative sources to talk about been used by historians. But somehow there has been an emphasis of overuse. So I started kind of looking at more in the so I kind of started looking at the records of the sailors' home in order to kind of unpack the daily. Is my internet connection unstable? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Yeah. So I started kind of looking at the scientific and medical journals, machine records, and and also when I was kind of looking into all that, I thought that I would be able to kind of get hold on diaries, or like and memoirs and things like that. But again, unfortunately, I wasn't being able to get that as well. So at that point as I said at the beginning, I started working on, as far as the geographical location was concerned, I was working on Calcutta and Bombay. But just in order to kind of trying to find material beyond, when I started looking at the sailors or the seamen's health, not just to do with India, but I was looking at Australia, I started looking at America and Canada and things like that. So I was fortunate enough to I came across, like, suppose, for example, if there was the American sailors home, suppose there was a sailors home in New York, I found maybe a few lines there on the Calcutta sailors home and things like that. So maybe newspaper records. So newspapers, not just the ones that were published in India or even in the UK, but maybe in Europe or maybe in the United States. So the reason I'm just saying is that for all the, like the students, like the graduate students who are pursuing their PhDs, like I understand, and especially, if you're kind of working on a subject, for which you need to kind of travel beyond. So I'm sure like your academic institutions will give you that support. But for your initial period, as you're going to kind of start working from home, of course, there are these, like a lot of material has already been digitized. But again, I have a little problem when, many of us, obviously there's a lot of material which has been digitized and it's been extremely helpful for us. But at the same time, like the kind of material that has been digitized. So in the sense that, like if I'm talking about, so then we kind of come to question the material itself, that what kind of records are digitized, who is kind of given more preference over the other, and things like that. And people like, if I'm working on India, and I'm sure like, there's a lot on India, but I don't know, I'm not very sure if someone who's working on other, I shouldn't point out, but somehow, like areas that geographical areas that have not been covered yet. I'm sure there are many, several other historians, aspiring historians who are working on that. So these are challenging times, but for them, I would say that, you could always try to kind of, that's why global history, I think, plays a very significant role. That is connected history, that is transnational history. That is by kind of trying to kind of unravel the histories of your own past, that region that you're looking into. But if you kind of maybe start looking at the similar kind of stories in other parts of the world, maybe you could try to get something, out of that as well. Now, after rambling all that, I would finally come to say that what exactly I was like my work kind of, and which hopefully I would be able to kind of turn into my first monograph sometime, maybe I don't know how many years it will take, but then, so nevertheless. So my thesis primarily, it examined the health and the welfare of and the sanitary regulation of the European seamen. Now, in doing so, I aim to do kind of like, firstly, I kind of sought to see and that how and to what extent maritime medicine helped to shape the understanding of health and hygiene in the tropics. So as I mentioned a bit, some time back, that this was already done when it came to the health of the army. So, but I kind of tried to look at this kind of this to the lenses of the maritime health and hygiene. And because there is very little actually known on the impact of the European seamen and the maritime medicine, and the shaping of the public health and so on in British India. And also in doing so, I sought to kind of expand our current understanding of imperial medicine, that in a British colony through a study of mobile subjects, the mobile British wide subjects, the British vulnerable subjects, if I may call them so. And it kind of, my thesis kind of argued that while looking at the seamen's health in transit and in imperial port cities, it was kind of this kind of study. It was kind of rather this way of doing research. It would be instrumental. Can you hear me? Sorry, it's just saying that the internet connection is unstable. Sorry. Yeah. So, so in this thesis, so I argued that the seaman's health in transit and in as well as in the imperial port cities was instrumental in the development of the tropical hygiene and in the sanitary reform. That kind of played a significant role and an indispensable mechanism for the empire building. Now, through a study of these go-betweeners, as in the seamen, who link the metropole and the periphery, as in the colonies, and the role of imperialism and philanthropy in shaping the public health, I sought to kind of to broaden, the understanding of maybe the political, the medical, and civilian personnel of the British Empire, and the way they kind of governed their poor and the vulnerable white imperial subject. And so in looking at that, as I mentioned before, I kind of looked at government records, mission records, and the scientific and medical journals, newspapers, and things. Now, this has to do with my research. And but apart from this, I kind of came across this very interesting article by Laura Spinney. You must have kind of come across that it came out in Nature in December 2020, as in, what are the COVID archivists keeping for tomorrow's historians? So as someone who, as a medical historian, as someone working on the public, on the history of the public health and disease, I think because of the kind of, I think it's not only for the archivist and for maybe the museum curators and the way they are kind of envisaging, like how things are going to be, how they are going to be, I'm sure they are going to come up as and when COVID comes to an end. They must be planning something. But I think it's also to do with us as historians, that we start documenting facts. I'm sure, like there are these lot of actually databases that I came through in the that are available on the net, that kind of but there are these numerous websites which kind of they have come out with they kind of list all these the stories that come on the different websites, the news media and the social media posts that come up from the government as well as the non-governmental organizations, be it on the society or the status of the healthcare workers and the scientists and so on and so forth. Now, because I'm sure like the sociologists at this point, they are all very busy, kind of writing things and and they are kind of busy doing their field work. But I think that as historians as well, we should try and maybe frame in our own minds and kind of I'm sure because I find so many correlations between what was going on in the 19th century or in the early 20th century, even in the mid 20th century, as to exactly what what's the current situation, the scenario is. I think I should just stop at that as and then we could just come up and when the conversation starts. Of the question.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Namrata. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, Ismay, and all the co-conveners for inviting me to the symposium. And I look forward to today's conversation with all our fellow co-panelists, as well as members of the audience. I think I'll approach this question from my own experience first of working on global history, or more precisely, global health history, as a postdoctoral fellow based at the Center for Global Health Histories, which was also World Health Organization Collaborating Center. As a postdoctoral fellow, I was quite involved in the various activities of the center. I was organizing, chairing at their flagship Global Health History seminars, which involved working with partners like the WHO's European Regional Office in Copenhagen. So the center had graduate students, doctoral fellows, all working on histories of health and medicine, disproportionate number of people working on smallpox, primarily drawing on the expertise of the center. And there were several visiting scholars who passed through the center. So these questions of positionality then, I think, are central to global history. And being based there, and this was my first brush with global history, to be very frank, or doing global history, doing global health history. And I think I'll probably write a piece about this at some point, especially the fact that I was based at York. My being based at York also meant that I had access to a number of archives which were based in the UK. For example, the British Library, Wellcome, which housed quite a bit of post-colonial material. And I've been thinking about my access to the Geneva archives as well, because it brings in the question of political economy of archival research. My funding body did not give me a very huge sum for archival visits. And though my subject was India, I think I wouldn't have been able to travel to India and stay here for a longer period. So I chose to look at the material that I could gather in Geneva. And from my own experience of working on 20th century, because I've been a 20th century historian, I know the condition of archives of post-1947 period, which is the post-independence period. I thought I would be hedging my bets if I went to Geneva and other archives in the UK, rather than think of coming back to India. So it was a very tactical decision, but it was also, I was also persuaded by the funds at my disposal. I do, of course, know of the merits of the strategy that the historian of science, Sujit Sivasundram, advocates. For example, to divorce the sources from the usual sites of contextualization. For example, he advocates reading a palm leaf manuscript and murals within the context of European sources to learn about Kandyan botany, which is Sri Lankan botany, rather than complaining about a scarcity of sources stemming from a non-European perspective. And yet, we must recognize that in post-colonial India, at least, the efforts to create accessible archives of scientific institutions is very recent. The historian Indira Chaudhary, who has worked in setting up several such archives of institutions, of leading institutions like the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research or Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, and she's also worked towards producing oral histories, draws attention to these issues. And she says this has really recently begun, only since 2008. If you turn to history of medicine, I would like to share that I tried to access the material in the National Medical Library in New Delhi, but there was no website, and I thought when I returned to India at the end of March 2020, I would be able to access a lot more material in India because travel within India was possible. But the pandemic came and we couldn't travel anywhere. I was to begin a fresh project on health diplomacy with an archival visit to the Rockefeller Archive Center in the US. And that's, I think, something that comes from the nature of transnational subjects that we are studying. Our subjects of research are extremely mobile. So they were in the US, they were collaborating with financial institutions and donor institutions in the US. And naturally, so Rockefeller was a very important source for this material of looking at health history of 1950s and 1960s, apart from institutions in India. But in the meantime, I also discovered that increasingly Indian libraries are digitizing their stuff, putting it up on their websites. The National Archives of India, which is the repository of almost everything that is of great importance and which emanates from the central government, has begun this service which is called Digitize on Demand. And I'm a bit wary of this service because I think it reinforces the issues of access, the issues of who pays, and what gets digitized in some interesting ways. And I think we need to do a little bit more work on what does digitize on demand mean for a country like India or other kinds of countries from low and middle income backgrounds. So just to wrap up, this project on health diplomacy in the 1950s and 60s also was, also meant that I had to contribute a journal article. And this entire article, given the pandemic, was written completely based on digital material because I couldn't travel. And to wrap up, I would also like to say that the pandemic gave me a moment to think about other kinds of difficulties of access, which probably I didn't pay attention to. For example, difficulties of the disabled, people who have disproportionately large care responsibilities. And I think the pandemic has brought to light all these issues for archival research, for field-based work, for a large number of historians and not just global historians. And I think I'll stop at this. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you. Or if you want to start.
Yeah, so I have prepared some slides. Are you able to see my screen? Yeah, so like when I saw the question that we're discussing, like in general in this series of seminars, like I decided maybe we should also question the question itself and think about what we mean by archives. And when I think of archives, like because of the research that I've been trying to do also, I also think about, for example, biomedical records, medical records, and at times human remains and genetic databases and so on. It's like Sarah, I work on hospital architecture. So architecture can also be considered a part of like an archive, like buildings and so on. So obviously during the pandemic, it wasn't easy to travel and see buildings in different parts of the world, like if you're trying to do global history. But there is also another thing that we should think about, I think, and is intersectionality. When we think about global history and, like archives in a more universal context, we tend to divide things into global south and north at times, but there's also this intersectionality, who gets to be represented in archives. And in my experience as a researcher in my previous work, like until 2018, I worked on the built environment for education, specifically for women's education. And something that I experienced was that the educational institutions that I was looking at, they were like the elitist institutions I was able to find more resources on, archival resources on. And, the ones that spoke to, like in the context of late 19th century, the schools that offered services to, lower classes of society, the archives were very limited, like the resources that I was able to find. And especially when it comes to user experience, and this is something that is very visible if you're studying healthcare architecture as well. The voices of the the patients, for example, in the case of hospital architecture, they aren't really visible in the archive. And with that, senses are also not out there, meaning what we hear and, things that are obviously, like when we think about the hospital, what people ate in the hospital food is also part of that. And I've been trying to find ways to understand what patients, like during the pandemic, for example, doing research on different hospitals located in the late Ottoman Empire and also like in the early years of the Republic. I decided to look at literature, like works of literature, novels, and so on, to see if there are any descriptions, and obviously these aren't very reliable sources, but I also consider novels like an archival material. I think we can treat them that way. Another idea was to use oral history. And how do we do that? And so now I have this project called Birth as a Sensory Experience, and the initial results of which will be presented at a Wellcome Trust funded conference in 2022. And so I'm looking at environments where the event of birthing, delivery, child delivery takes place in a medicalized or pathologized setting. And to achieve this, I decided to talk to women who gave birth in different periods of Turkish history, and who are still alive, obviously. And we were able to recruit participants from the, intergenerational as well, talking about what the hospital felt like. And so I think oral history can be an answer to many gaps that we have in history. And also we now live in a time which is very, critical. Things are going to change afterwards. And we also, as historians, we also have to think about what we're leaving behind as archival sources for future generations, for people who will be writing history in the future, 100 years from now, trying to understand what happened during this pandemic. And for example, at our university, there's a community archive, so people can submit their day-to-day experiences with the pandemic. And this will serve as an archive in the future. And also, like, one thing which isn't related to my research, but related to this watercolor that you guys found to use as your on your poster, and I really loved it. And so, I mean, I don't know, like, may I maybe ask the participants, like everyone who's here, what they think about it when they see the image that was chosen for this seminar series? Like, if you can type in the chat box if you want.
Do you have like a complete picture of it?
Yeah, I do, but it comes with some information. So
okay.
yeah, and the next slide has some information. So if anyone wants to participate, like write something in the chat box, feel free to do so. I will just give like I don't know, like 10, 20 seconds or so, like if we have time. And so, yeah, the threat of erasure of archives. Yeah, okay. Does anyone else want to add anything? So, okay, I'm going to the next slide. And if anyone wants to contribute after some information is revealed, you're still welcome to do so. So I was really intrigued by this image. It's called Archive Folders. It's a watercolor, which was actually exhibited in Describing Architecture exhibit in 2012. And you can read the little catalog entry from the exhibition here. I copy pasted it from the Describing Architecture website. And I was really kind of shocked when I read this, because it's something that I've been thinking about, like what makes something archive, like, archives, like what do we value as archival material? What makes something research worthy? And I think this image really sums so much up. And I was so intrigued that I did a little research to find out what the inspiration was behind this image. And these are the archive folders that triggered the artist to produce that watercolor. And this archives and the avant-garde collection of Marzona, he donated them to the Staatliche Kunstsammlungen in Dresden in 2016. He's still alive, by the way. So it's, I mean, it really like brings up so many questions, I feel. And then another thing that I thought about was the 1972 World Heritage Convention and how they define what is worthy of being labeled as cultural heritage. And outstanding universal value, like how do we decide that something is like worthy of being archived or worthy of doing research on. So these are things that I've been thinking about. And it's always like, for example, in the case of hospitals, it always comes down to like how we understand the history of a place. So in the case of the history of the hospital, we understand it through the lens of either the people who funded, who gave the money, who patroned these places, the governments that allow these places to exist, or architects who left notes behind or their plans. But the actual people who use them are never present in these histories. So, and I think this idea is perpetuated in these kinds of documents as well. Like at the end of the day, people who write history also come from a certain socioeconomic class, and people who produce these documents are also, you know, privileged backgrounds. And so some certain classes are always left behind, I think, in history, within history. And when we, you know, look back at women's history, again, like this is the case, like women are not as visible as men in history. And so that's pretty much it for this portion. And there are some other slides that I want to share with people, but I don't want to take too much time right now. I want to like just show one image and ask people to think about it, maybe like, you know, in the later minutes of our conversation, we can maybe discuss this image. If you could just take a look at it, and if everyone could maybe think about a thing or two to say about what they see here, whether this could be an archive or what this might be, and maybe type it in the chat box, it would be great, because this is something very interesting. This place, like this is a door covered with snow, as you can see. And this is supposedly is the most important room in the world. So can you imagine what it might be? That's my question for everyone. This will, hopefully we will have a fun exercise with this. I will stop sharing my screen now, or I can continue to share and people can continue to look at it, whatever the conveners want to do. And I can share my screen again later. That's another option.
I think it would be great if you share it again later.
Okay, all right, perfect.
It's because I know you work on history of senses. I think history of senses also give us some. I don't know if you agree with me, but give us some ways of uncovering like different voices, because we can, when we work with history of senses and emotion, we can kind of bring literature more, like use literature as our sources to uncover voices. So maybe you can talk about that more. If I don't know if you agree with me, but my own experience has been like that. Thank you all for sharing your experience. It was I could, like, some of your experience was similar to mine, so it was interesting to hear that. So I'm going to ask the next question from Andrews. I want you maybe to talk more about the collaboration. Because one thing that we have also talking about, but maybe a way of look like forward for future for archives has been, maybe it can be collaboration, but you also collaborate not with historians, as you were talking, with other, and also how these materials specifically, how do you use them in classroom? Is it possible to use them? Sorry, I'm asking too much question, too many questions. If you also want to talk about more about the exhibition that you have, I know Or is also interested in curation studies, and if museums can be used as archival materials. So if you want to, later, like after Andrews, to join the conversation, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks. Shall I start? Do you ask me, right? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps let me zoom in on the kind of collaboration aspects, and yeah, that's also. I would last 4 years. I was involved in a project with computer scientists that study, do kind of use AI and semantic technologies to understand complex archives, and I mean, this was really fascinating to me as a historian to see how other disciplines look at archives, and then in particular in these natural history archives and collections. They're extremely heterogeneous and multimodal. So it's not only text, but it's also objects. And then it's not even a text that starts on the upper left part of the page and then ends on the lower right part of the page, but it's really kind of visual landscapes on which travelers note what they've seen. And indeed, it's one of the challenges is that this is an extremely biased account of nature in other areas of the world. So what I wanted to show is I made one additional screen. I simply share my screen and to show you what we did with digital technologies, and then also a kind of conclusion to that, and then you can see what we do with that. So what I showed you how these kind of archives look like, and so what we did basically three things. So it's on the one hand, it's working with a kind of handwriting recognition software to train a handwriting recognizer to be able to search handwritten archives. So there's a lot of work done these days with various solutions. But the challenge with this very specific natural history archives is that people use different languages. In the archive we were working with, there were 5 languages mixed together, different handwritings, different so very kind of field manuscripts, but also then publications near to handwritings near to the kind of the final step before their publication. So you have different script styles and different modes of writing. And we used that with volunteers. We trained volunteers, and while involving volunteers, also volunteers learned about how nature was classified in the past. But then again here, you always have this enormous bias of these archives that non-European, all the helpers, and that's the fascinating thing about it. If you study these natural history archives, then you see the enormous amount of labor that went into producing these archives. It's really tens of thousands of helpers that helped the travelers to get through the landscape, to understand the landscape, to understand nature. That becomes kind of gradually visible. So another thing was kind of semantic annotation aspect. So we also, I mean, many of the animals and plants are not named as they were named 200 years ago. So there's enormous name changes involved. So we use kind of semantic technologies to link them together and kind of open up and increase accessibility of such archives. And that's mostly of interest to biodiversity heritage scholars, but also, of course, for historians who are really interested in, okay, what kind of animals were classified or described in a very specific area. I did a lot of work on kind of reconstructing that in Southeast Asia, in Java, but also Sumatra. So that's another thing. And the third thing is what I found quite fascinating, that a PhD at Leiden University has done really almost all of the work here. So I'm simply referring to that. It was kind of a zero-shot learning, it's called. So you have one collection of images that has very detailed metadata. So you train a computer to understand how the image and the metadata relate to each other, and then you can use the outcome of this learning process for a collection which has not been where there's no metadata available. It gives you kind of probabilities, for instance, if a bird is depicted, or so you can order and classify huge amounts of hand-drawn images, because natural history museums all over the world have millions of such images of plants and animals stored in their archives. But having said that, I mean, that was my lesson over the last 4 years, that even if you have the most sophisticated computational technologies and digitization practices, you will always need historians to understand and contextualize what you see on paper, because there's a lot of elements are silenced. On the upper right part, you see kind of collection circumstances documented with soldiers in the background, and someone in a local collector bringing a snake to travelers. So there's a enormous world in the background that needs careful reconstruction, and digital technologies can help to do that, but that needs to be in conversation, and one has to be really very careful that this large-scale digital infrastructures that are emerging are sensitive enough to such questions. And recently I was asked to contribute to a handbook. It will be published in July, the Rutledge Handbook on Science and Empire, by a colleague Andrew Goss in the US. I wrote a little piece about these kind of reflections. It's called Natural History, Collections and Empire. So that's my point for now. Sorry. pass it on. And perhaps one point about the teaching in classrooms. I teach at the Technical University as a philosophy of science and technology program, and their sources are not used for teaching. You really need papers and articles and have a kind of conceptual view on, okay, what does it mean for the history of science when you look at it from a non-European perspective? So it's a more conceptual point. So, and I use this kind of natural history stuff to illustrate these points, but it's not, fortunately, I cannot ask the students to do this kind of research.
Thank you. Or do you want to add anything here, or do you want to later talk about the curational studies later on? Okay, I just want to ask a question from Mani about the. You talk about the semen, and like the difficulties that you had to collect the information that you wanted, and how you had to change constantly, kind of, to something that I want to ask is, what, like, have you been able to find anything like written by seamen themselves? And also, if there were, that's also something that I'm interested myself. You may like answer that like later on. But if there were specific spaces, like if they did build or allocated specific spaces for seamen, for sailors, if you want to talk a little bit about that. Like, I know from my own experience that I wasn't able to access, especially related to missionary activities, to find any materials from the local people. So I had to specifically state that I'm not talking about, like, what I'm talking about is from the missionary point of view. So I would like to, maybe if you want to comment about that a little bit. So.
Thanks, Sarah, for your question. So when you're talking about how I was able to kind of get information, if I understood correctly, as in what happened to them when they were in the port cities, and how do we get to know more about that? I got to know quite a lot actually from the annual reports of the Sailors' Home, in the sense that, because these sailors, obviously they spent a lot of time, just near the shores. But apart from that, there were these homes, which were kind of assigned for them. They were known as the sailors' homes, where many of them actually lived. When I'm talking about the sailors and seamen, one needs to also understand that I'm talking about the majority of them. So I'm not talking about the designated and the proper officers, but rather, if I could call the laymen. And also another thing is that when they're traveling from one port to the other, sometimes they used to quit their job, sometimes they used to start doing something else. So apart from these annual reports, many a times you also get some amount of information also in the the criminal records, or in the jail records, in the newspapers. So if you're going, suppose one of my chapters, I kind of worked on the adulteration of liquor, and how kind of that, and the role of the adulteration of liquor in the spread of cholera in Calcutta in the 19th century. So when I was kind of trying to do that bit, again, I kind of got to know what exactly, and how and what they did, maybe in the streets of the sailor town, sailor town as I have understood and I have kind of defined. And and there was something else that you asked. I'm sorry, I forgot. There was something else that you asked.
Yeah, I asked specifically about that's my own interest, but we can answer that later. About if there were specific spaces for sailors, like the specific hospitals or.
Okay. That's how. Okay. Of course, there were these sailors' hospitals, there were these sailors' homes, there were seamen's floating churches, there were these libraries, But that's the problem. The problem is that you get, like obviously these are mentioned in in reports, in newspapers, but not like, you don't get to know a lot. That's the unfortunate part. So, as in, like, if you because it would have been so much easier for me to do the work if I would have got like maybe, like as you said, like if I would have got memoirs or diaries and things like that. And also because I was working on the health aspect, and when I'm talking about health, I meant welfare, welfare measures as well. So I think that was again another reason behind which, because, so for example, so many people have asked me, why don't you look at the log books? Of course I've looked at the log books, but over there nothing really comes up when it took, like to understand the everyday life of the sailors. And that's what actually I got interested. So initially I was looking at, like I'm looking at tropical health, hygiene, maritime, maritime health and hygiene, and obviously I'm looking at diseases, I'm looking at the liquor problem, I'm looking at what was happening during the cholera epidemic and things like that. But in between everything, like, the question that really stuck with me was the everyday life of the sailor. Because, like compared to the amount of like you get to know a lot on when it comes to the the daily life of the soldiers, for example, what is happening in the army cantonment. But if you kind of compare to that, to what was happening with the sailor, you don't really get to know like as that much. So yeah, so if for example, that's what exactly I was trying to, that was the reason I kind of narrated my experience in doing this research. Like, for example, when I was looking at the sailors' home in New York, suppose these sailors who were present there, maybe for some period of time, they were in Calcutta. So at that point, and because Calcutta Sailors' Home, in fact, was very, very important when it came, because in fact, there was a time when I wanted to kind of work on the global history of Sailors' Home, in the sense that, like, but maybe that's for some, maybe that, I don't know when I can do that. But so, like the Calcutta Sailors' Home, in fact, was very important. So there was, suppose there were these friends, Calcutta Friends, Cement Society and things like that. But and at least until now, I haven't been able to find any proper reports. Here and there, yes, extracts, yes, but something very directly linked. For example, even like suppose in 2015 and 16, when I started with my work, that time, initially, I wasn't been able to find that amount on the Calcutta Sailors' Home itself. But last year, when I was looking, because I was working on my book manuscript and things like that, and that's how I got to. I suddenly stumbled that there's, when I'm kind of given, like which Andres was just mentioning, search engines. This is also a very tricky thing, you see. So, and then I found that there's quite a lot of material that again I found on Calcutta Sailors' Home, now on the British Library search engine. So, like which has been cataloged, which has been given more preference. So there are these very, like very, very difficult, and tricky questions to answer. For example, like suppose if today, to deal with my next project, suppose that the project that I have in my mind on death, and when I was doing research and that, and I realized that, like this experience of mine for looking at alternative sources actually kind of quite helped me. So obviously, when you're looking at alternative sources, as you mentioned, literature is something definitely very important. So you need and especially suppose if I'm working on a specific geographical location, it's very important that you know the language. So the language becomes very, very central, I think, to your research, and the vernacular sources. So so I think that when you're talking about archival material, a lot depends on what exactly you're working on. If you're working on colonial period, if you're working on post-colonial period, which geographical location are you looking at, the availability of sources. Or another thing that I would really like to mention is that I think people should also, like people, when I say people, I mean the society as a whole. We should, like, especially in India, when I'm talking about, I'm talking about in the case, I'm talking about Indians. When I'm saying me, I mean an Indian. I think we should all kind of try to be more aware of what makes history. by that, I would say that, suppose the doctors who are kind of working day and night during the COVID period, maybe if they start writing something, maybe there have them been diaries and documents and things like that. The reason I'm saying, because, the other day when we were speaking, I was telling you that, like, I think this is a problem. I think that people who work on South Asia, I think we do face that, like, especially if you're coming down to post-colonial times, there is this dearth. I understand you have tweets, you have social media posts, people are writing on Facebook, Twitter, but sometimes I feel so scared that, maybe after 200 years or 300 years, I don't know what's going to happen to the internet. And if one day everything just comes, clashes, and then what happens? I still feel that, as a historian, that there is this importance of writing things down on a piece of paper. Like I think like, I understand we are all kind of typing these days, but I think the importance of printed source, we can never, I don't know, I don't think that has actually got diminished, because I understand, because these days, you have everything on the internet, but I think there is a need, because a pen and paper somewhere, because, as you're trying to talk about doing history, as a historian, when you're trying to do work in the archive during the pandemic, apart from logistics, like, apart from other problems, like, lockdown and things like that, and other rationale, which we definitely need to keep in mind, the other thing is our minds, our troubled minds. So if I try to write, suppose, on the history of COVID, or like the present history of COVID, so somewhere down the line, I think myself and the historian in me will merge, right? My own experience. So I think documenting these facts are also very, very important. The doctors, the nurses, the sanitation workers, also, like, like, just trying to, because I was reading this article which I mentioned, and that came out in Lancet, and it's very interesting how they're saying that, the museum curators, they are trying to kind of get hold of all these unused, or used perhaps ventilators, and, like, things like it could be scientific instruments, medical, it could be medical reports, it could be prescriptions. So like, these, in fact, like, I'm sure, like, all of us have actually questioned ourselves then, and during the times of emails, what do we do? How was a historian after 100 years? We are not getting to read these correspondence. Then how does a historian after 100 years work?
Yes, I am. And I agree. I think I also links to the point that the Orr was making about the oral history and
Absolutely.
how we are using the oral history.
May I just jump in and add something about ethics as well?
Yes, sure. And I also want to, Namrata, maybe to comment more about, we have a conversation about open access. And you made a very good point about that. If also you want to talk a little bit about that, or of course, if you want also, whoever wants to go first, that's okay with me.
Or do you want to go now, or can I go?
Just about, like, biomedical.
Yeah. Okay.
And, like, so it's a bit related to what Mike Carnico was saying. That's what maybe.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, if you want, yeah.
Keep the flow. So there is also this aspect of ethics, like bioethics, involved when we're talking about biomedical records, like medical records and so on. And this has been a big issue in the past in the medical context. And if we look at live tissue as archival material as well, then it's a huge problem, right? And for example, what was it, like the Adler-Hay scandal, for example, in the United Kingdom, and in 2004, the Live Tissue Act passed in the UK. So there has to be, like, consent is something that's very important, like in the case of oral history as well, for example. Right now, we are talking to, like, in 2 days, actually, I'm going to have yet another meeting with the university's lawyers, for example, because, like, everything has to be very carefully decided who can access these, and because people are sharing very sensitive information about themselves, about their day-to-day lives, some very intimate experiences that they had, and we shouldn't take these lightly, and there should be certain, I think, limitations as well. Yeah, as much as I support like open access and all that stuff, but you know, when we're talking about people's private information or biomedical, you know, human tissue or genetics, like, you know, gene sequences and so on, which is now, you know, being archived in a way. Like, for example, my friend at McGill had a project called GeneDig, you know, which you can just go in and look for any kind of like any condition, like breast cancer. Okay, you can see the genetic sequence for that in a database. It's accessible from anywhere in the world. So these are all things that we have to think about as historians and as people who study the history of science and medicine. And in the case of, for example, like the information that's available on the internet, which is being archived, there is a website called archive.org. Again, it's a case of ethics, because some things, like there is something called right to be forgotten, and people might want to, like, might be deleting things from the internet, from, you know, they might want to get rid of the parts of their digital footprint, and it's being archived without providing consent to this website. And what happens to that? So these are things that we are still trying to figure out, and this might be a good platform to think about that. But I wanted to mention, and I have a comment to make about education and like how we deal with certain things in the classroom as well, but this can wait till later.
So can I go now?
Yes, please, if you want to.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
So can you see my slide well?
Yes, I just make I just quickly, I think we are somehow running out of time. Maybe we can have more, like, talk a little more for 10-15 minutes more, and then we can open it to questions. Yeah.
Okay. I'll stick to time. So this is the title of my upcoming monograph, Piloting Global Smallpox Eradication, India, 1957 to 67. I'm almost giving a book talk. So the death of smallpox was formally announced in 1980, and this was following a 10-year program from 1967 to 1977. And this is the period which has received maximum historical attention. This is the period that has been the subject of several monographs. And this is the period which constitutes the bulk of the history within the institution as well. So if you look at the WHO produced, the World Health Organization produced history, 1967 to 1977 would get the lion's share of attention. Why is this? In 1966, a separate smallpox eradication unit was set up in Geneva. Funds were committed to the program, and individual countries in Africa, South America, and Asia were asked to commit to this global campaign. Now, I'm shifting the attention away from this decade to 10 years prior to 67. So I'm arguing for looking at the period between 1957 and 67. And the reason is India had its own smallpox eradication program, which began in 1962. And this provided a template for the reorientation of global strategy. At this point of time, this was the largest program in the world. India's population was 440 million. The program lasted till 1967, and despite intensive vaccination, smallpox reappeared with big epidemics in 1966 and so on. So it was globally almost as if when the WHO was pushing for global smallpox eradication, India was dragging its feet. India was trying to withdraw from the global program. And in any case, India was the last country to sign the agreement with the WHO, despite sharing 50% of the disease burden. And this constitutes a very interesting moment between 1967 to 1970 when India actually joined the program. Despite what can be seen as a failure, the scale and challenges meant that this program was studied very carefully at WHO, and India's scientific and medical elite found themselves in the global committees on smallpox eradication. For instance, the first scientific committee that met in Geneva in 1964 had 2 Indian members. The Indian experience of smallpox eradication informed the deliberations of this committee. Vaccination targets were revised, and this recalibrated the goals of the global program. Dr. Lal, who you see to your left, was actually part of another international committee that was to set the strategy for worldwide eradication. But we do not know anything about this committee, and Dr. Lal has also disappeared from the WHO Global Archive. This is because a new scientific committee was formed, and Dr. Rao was part of both of these, and it revised the targets that were set. So in the current moment of battling COVID, I can only think of the confusion over masks in the beginning that we heard about, or in the current moment, the vacillation on the advisory of advice regarding aerosol transmission, as parallels about how scientific advisories are formulated and indeed communicated to the general public. And it is this contingent nature of smallpox eradication expertise that has been pointed out by historians like Nancy Steppen, but I think it hasn't been adequately addressed in global histories of eradication. And there are other historiographical concerns as well, which I would flag. Institutional histories and official accounts look at the program as radiating from Geneva. So country-specific accounts then are seen as a bottoms-up approach. And I can look at Gilberto Hockman's work on Brazil as a very good rendition of the shifting fortunes of the program with the change in the political regimes at the center. The problem of decentering the WHO perspective also comes because we are relying on the smallpox eradication archive, which is digitized, and it is part of the UNESCO's Memory of the World Register. This might be very tempting for scholars who are happy with digital access, but just to clarify, it actually means that bulky files are sent to you over WeTransfer, and paper files have been digitized, archival aids have been digitized, and the historical labor of archival research actually happens on the desk and not within the physical space of the archive. And I think all of us have experiences of being in the archive, visiting the archive in person, and which is transformed in major ways. Working on a bottoms-up approach also meant that I had to complement my sources from the WHO archive with Indian publications, journals, and even government mouthpieces, because this would tell me how was India communicating the program to the world. So the material that I've tapped is IEC material, and you can see some of it here on the slides. To your right is material from a weekly that was published, which was called National Smallpox Eradication News, and this was published both in English and in Hindi to communicate with the workers of the program. To your left, you see the official publication of the Ministry of Health, and smallpox features on the cover page. There were special issues. And here I would also like to point out a curious inversion. And this relates to the WHO's photographic archive, which has an overwhelming number of images from this period of the program. So the 1962-1967 period seems to be overrepresented as compared to the later period. And I have points to make about this as well. Apologies for the quality of the visuals, but these were really meant to be ephemera. I've also tracked several scientific journals and publications, textbooks, and it is through this material that I learned about Dr. A.R. Rao, the medical doctor and the bureaucrat who you saw in a previous slide. Rao wrote a textbook on smallpox in 1972, and this was the largest study of smallpox in a hospital setting. So he drew on larger networks of collaboration with American institutions, but I flagged his work in Indian journals. Rao introduced a number of innovations, but in many ways, he is a forgotten face of the global smallpox eradication program. Southern India was smallpox free when the global program was launched in 1967, a fact which is only mildly acknowledged in WHO's official history. The scientific knowledge and experience of the program generated in India was disseminated to the world. And to quote the historian Mariolana Espinosa, who studies Latin American history of medicine, events occurring in the scientific periphery do not logically render them peripheral to science. Finally, I want to make one comment on the standard refrain about paucity of historical material, archival material in settings like ours, especially post-colonial India, when archives post-1947 are largely closed. And I would add that I'm still looking for Indian language responses to the eradication program, participant histories written by doctors, but I've been unable to gather too much, and the pandemic exacerbated this difficulty. This is an ongoing effort, and one can either lament about the sources or raise questions of representation within the archive, or find newer ways to surface the voices and faces of the Indian participants of the program. I've often heard that there were no women in the Indian eradication program, and here we have a woman vaccinator vaccinating a sweet little child from a school, and this is the Indian program. Thank you.